Hey, fellow Geneteers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we're back at it. We had started this series that was really kind of in honor and recognition of a loss of someone in our Jin and Tantra community who had his loved one pass away. And so we wanted to do this series of episodes as kind of a shout out and recognition of that. And as the fates would have it, over the course of the summer, I also found myself in a situation where I had a close family member who passed away too. So it ended up being kind of hitting close to home for me as well. So we were in the midst of finishing up this series. We were really talking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the misnamed Book of the Dead, the Book of the Bardo, the Book of the In-Between, which talks about like what happens with, the end of life. And so we were doing a little series on that. We got a little sidetracked because I had the actual loss in my family, but we're getting back to it. We want to finish it up, but before we do that, we have a special announcement from one of our G&T people, one Daniel, to talk about what he has coming up. So we wanted to talk about that first before we did anything of the gory details of the episode about death. Okay, thanks, Daniel. So passing it over to you.
Yeah, so for people who are interested, I'm going to be, or at least me and my fiance will be leading a retreat in Mexico, about maybe 2 hour and a half south of Tulum at our friend's retreat center. And that person was Remy DeLune, who we had on maybe about 2 months ago on the podcast. Him and I did an interview together. So I will leave the description to our We Travel page in the description of this podcast for people who are interested. But briefly, it's at the end of January. It's about a week long, like Saturday to Saturday. So January 28th to February 4th. We'll be doing 2 medicine ceremonies, and then we'll check out the land, do some hiking, go to some ruins, stay at a really nice, it's not like a high class resort, but it's really deep in the jungle. You're definitely away from society. And if you're from the Midwest, who doesn't want to go down to Mexico in the middle of the wintertime, get away, get some retreat, get some R&R, and do some healing and do some work. And it's funny, actually, like the translation of ayahuasca in the Shipibo tradition actually means vine of the dead. So it kind of, we can kind of fit, because a lot of people take it
thematically into the episode.
Yeah, and that's what's most important, Eric, is can we get it to thematically fit?
How can we strangle these episodes to seem like they're connected?
That's right. Yeah. So I'll leave the link in the description for people who are interested. And if you're interested in seeing Remy, obviously we've been on this thing for now two plus years.
Mm-hmm.
But the interview with Remy is definitely worthwhile checking out if you haven't yet. And if you're interested in him, then yeah, that'll be it.
We have episodes too about your experiences, doing your shamanic experiences down in Peru, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
We have other episodes too. So we have kind of maybe a whole series of people want to learn more about that way too.
Yeah. I kind of like don't do a ton of that, because it's kind of like, I won't say it's saturated, but there's so many people who now fortunately have been able to experience it, that share their experience, and in the lexicon of podcasting, that I don't necessarily need to divulge everything, because it's kind of out there, and I've given some, and people will have their own if they're interested,
Well, I kind of get like, all right, so this is you and me. We're always personal on these things. So I always sort of figure like when you're ready to talk about something, you'll talk about it.
Yeah.
We talk about stuff that doesn't make it into this podcast.
This is true.
And so I always sort of figure like, whatever experiences you want to share, when you're ready to share them, if you want to, you'll do.
Yeah, that's right.
There's always a subtle pressure in this.
Oh, always a subtle pressure. Yeah.
Between us. Talk about this shit, talk about that shit. But okay. All right, so it should be a great event, right? I know you did another one of these recently.
We've done,
and this should be an ongoing thing. Will you be offering this thing to people periodically? And I think that's fucking fantastic. So
yeah, it's life. I mean,
right?
It can definitely be life changing, and the timing for people is always so perfect. It's magic. I mean, it really is magic. It's just such a beautiful experience for people who've never been able to sit in a ceremonial setting and do healing in a group community, because that's traditionally how it was done. It's something worth doing in your lifetime, I can say for sure.
Yeah, we have our way back in the day. We did one of my favorite little eepisodes where we talked about our psychedelic experiences too.
Yeah,
like way back in the day.
Yeah.
And life's changing.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And who knows where that door opens, and then they'll go to all kinds of places.
You
don't know where it's going to take you after that, but you get that crack in the door.
And I think the other interesting
The
part,
horses are on the track and the journey begins.
and
Yeah.
the journey really begins like when you decide to go. Like
Yeah.
you don't even have to wait. There's people who are already making deep changes to their life, just getting in preparation, getting rid of, wine addiction or marijuana or whatever, abuse, something like this. So it's cool, man. It's cool to be a part of it. It's like, what we're doing in this podcast, but just like really condensed, because we do this in real life. I mean, you're a practitioner, I'm a practitioner. So we're doing, this is the life. This is not
I think like, back in the day when we first started like getting to know one another, that was one of the things that bonded us together. We both wanted to be somehow trying to do this, helping to reach out with people who would be interested in these things and trying to become a help to people with this. I mean, that's been the goal the whole time. So all right, very cool.
Sweet.
So back to death. We were talking about this idea of what happens sort of like in the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Bardo, when spirit separates from the body. And there's a long conversation about how that works. And we kind of started it last time, and we reached a certain critical point in the discussion, and then it was time to take a break and come back. So we really had kind of like talked about this idea of the aggregates that make up a person. So it seemed to be like briefly just talking about that, because it's it takes a little bit to grow on you, I think, as an idea, but once the idea grows on you, it really kind of, it's pretty profound, right?
Yeah.
When it finally hits you.
And Eric, that for people who didn't hear that first episode, that episode is called The Separation of Yin and Yang, which I'll title this Separation of Yin and Yang Part 2, but just to be able to go back and give people, and we kind of talked about the dissolutions of the body and the mind during the transition process more towards the end of the episode, or the latter half. So we'll, just to give people some reference as to where we were before.
So it's kind of like this idea of these aggregates, and I remember first reading about them in undergrad or something like that, and like not kind of knowing what to think about that exactly, but it's kind of like an observation about all the different components that make up a person or make up a living thing. And we're a very materialistic world now. I think it's probably fair to say that. Not even just our society, but the world is materialistic. And so you tend to think of yourself as being like just your physical body, and you can break your physical body up into all kinds of components too. But now they go beyond that. So they have like the form part of the person. When you do it connected to the elements, you make this part of the earth element. And so that starts to go, even when my uncle was, going through, his experiences now, he was diagnosed with dementia, but he'd have moments of lucidity. And there are times that he'd be saying like, oh, my body's just falling apart. This thing is falling apart. It's not holding up anymore. And it's like, you could think like, that's the form aspect of the person. Right. And eventually, when any of us go, it's going to eventually like fall apart. So he was kind of going through that experience. Right. And then the other part that happens after that, though, once you get past the physical aspect of the person, and again, this is just brief on this, but we talked about this thing called the feeling aggregate, or the feeling aspect of the person. So you're talking about the emotions of the person. And I think Buddhism does a really interesting thing. You get a lot of divisions of how you can think about how the emotions can be kind of like organized, right? Groups of emotions. We come from the Chinese medical world. They have a way of talking about these 7 major emotions. But in this way of talking, they do this really interesting thing where they just break it up into 3 big groups and then like smaller things underneath. And it's kind of the idea that you either feel drawn to things, so positive emotions, you feel repelled by things, negative emotions. Sometimes I'll say aversion, or like neutrality. You're kind of indifferent to things. And it's a really interesting way to think about that. I don't know. That's been very helpful to me, Daniel. I find myself when I'm trying to explain things to people, I sometimes go like, well, listen, there's 3 ways you can feel about something.
Correct.
And if you really think about it, this is how it is. Or there's 3 ways that things can impact people positively, negatively, or kind of like neutrally. It's like, I don't know, it's really handy.
It's handy. I will say though, and maybe just because I'm so used to doing the kind of like Chinese medicine Taoist kind of view of things, people, when you break down the emotions and the elements in the Taoist view, it really does. People get it. Like you don't have to, like it doesn't require a whole lot of like history. I guess I could, Yeah,
you don't need a big backstory to understand. Someone says you have sadness and grief, fear and fright, anger, worry and rumination and happiness. right? Or
Mm-hmm.
joy. You break that down to people, they'll be like, oh yeah, that probably covers a big range of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you just kind of can go underneath that. So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the typical way you do this, like, yeah, in Chinese thought. I think the one that goes here is that you just break it down into these 3 different groups,
Mm-hmm.
and then it gives you this chance to go like, okay, how do I feel about this thing? Am I neutral? Am I this way or that way? And sometimes you can even go through the course of your day and you can be like, well, am I kind of happy? Am I kind of like, eh? Or am I kind of like, eh?
Right.
You know, sometimes you're just like, eh, you know, and actually it's funny because a lot of times you're just like, eh, you know, you're not like one way or the other. That's the neutrality feeling, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. All right, so that's the kind of the feeling thing. And then I think, you know, what you're talking about, Daniel, all those like subdivisions of those emotions will sort of fit underneath there some way or another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like they can fit together. Yeah, most things can. All right, then that's the water,
Yeah.
right, going with feeling. So that seems like that makes a kind of intuitive sense. And then there's the fire, and that's connected with something you can kind of talk about as being the concepts of the person.
Yeah,
right?
we talked. Yeah, we talked.
Yeah, kind of that idea. Sometimes they'll talk about discrimination, but you know that word sounds kind of funny in English. So so whatever you want to do with that, whatever terminology works for you. You had one that you liked. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Discernments.
Discernment. That also seems good. Yeah. So this is kind of a person's sort of concepts and categories of their life, how they organize things cognitively or mentally. And so at this point, you kind of get to what the psychology is talking about. You have this idea of the physical form, the feelings, and then sort of the mental categories of the person.
Would you?
Right?
Could we say that this could also be something like archetypes here?
Okay, you know, let's come back to it because there's a really interesting question about this archetype thing, and it's, to my mind, it's coming up. So I'll see what you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, where does an archetype fit into this whole thing? It's kind of like an interesting discussion. Yeah. So I've been thinking about that whole thing a lot lately too. So that's very timely. All right, so that's the fire thing in our quickie review. And then they talk about this idea of wind element or energy. This is where you get the word prana being used here, right, for energy. And this is a kind of a funny one to talk about when you think about what makes up a person, because you can get a very complicated idea here of what they call compositional factors, which is sort of like all the karmic energetic elements that make up a person. And that gets really complicated. Or sometimes when they talk about in terms of like a person's life and the end of their life, they just talk about kind of their goals, their big picture agendas. Those kinds of things can be kind of captured here. And I think when you have to simplify it down, that's kind of handy. Lama Glenn Mullen will do that at times that way. And they do that when they talk about it specifically with the death of a person. You know, like, it's an interesting idea. Like, maybe we all have big picture agenda things that we want to accomplish in the terms of our life. Like, maybe for some person, it's really important to be a mom. For another person, it's really important to be successful in their career. For another person, it's really important to find like relationships and love. For another person, it's really important to find spirituality or whatever it is. You know, you have these very big picture, big ticket items on the agenda that you're kind of like, you really want to get. And so it has something to do with that on some level.
But Eric, I'll tell you, man, I don't have them really. You know,
I don't know if that's true.
No, it is. I mean,
I don't want to like, I don't.
Yeah. No, but I mean,
I don't want to talk about your. I don't know.
There's things that I want to do, but I don't know that I have like some like grand scheme. Like, I just want to continue to be, you know, of service, useful. You know, have some creative outlets. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's.
I think that's what they mean. It's like the things that like kind of drive the person forward on some
okay. So
it's where the energy comes from, right? It's the energy.
So it's not like a bucket list thing. You're like, well, I really wanted to build the Taj Mahal in Albuquerque, but you know.
Yeah. I wanted to do like a drive-in version of the Taj Mahal.
Yeah.
Where I serve burgers. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of what I get. That's the idea. It's grown on me over time.
Okay.
That so when you start like digging down to people, there's probably things that really drive them.
Right. So like, could almost say like tendencies, karmic tendencies.
Yeah, I get that. But I mean, well, I guess, yeah, we'll throw that to the audience to think about it too. I mean, think about it for yourself and see what you think. But my sense is like when you dig down somewhere underneath, you probably have things like, well, if that doesn't work out for this person, they're going to have a serious problem because it's deep enough to drive them.
Right. The drive. There you go. Drive. What's your drive?
Drive is really deep.
Yeah.
So maybe if you dig down deep, you might find those kinds of things. That doesn't have to be like one thing necessarily.
Right.
Honestly.
Right.
But you realize like, oh, that's really at the core of who this person is.
Okay, that's
Like, I don't know. If we do talk about it, like in terms of my professional career, like I care a little bit, but not that much. That doesn't drive me. If it really drove me, I'd be doing a lot of things different and made different decisions and do things a lot harder. But only like, so it matters, but it's not really it. You know what I mean?
right,
But
right.
those things that you'll really drive at.
Yeah,
But something that's like, obviously we're doing a spirituality podcast, so for a lot of us, this is going to be a spirituality question.
yeah.
That was like one of the preeminent questions in my life. So that was a major driver. But other things, are there too. You know,
Mhm.
and you mentioned some of it, I think too. Like, if you don't feel creative, then you'll feel, you
Yeah.
know. So it can be even more abstract. It doesn't have to be that concrete. Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess we get to all think about it for ourselves,
Hmm.
right? If we look deep, do we start to find like, oh, there are quintessential drivers. Sometimes you find that when you have to like, you're making choices, you realize, oh, this is actually more important. And then you learn that about yourself, maybe. Anyway, something to think about. Yeah. Okay, then I can't remember where we got to. I think we got to the idea of consciousness, but I think we stopped there, right?
We stopped right here with fire.
Yeah. Oh, we did the wind one too. We did a compositional.
We did fire and wind. Yeah.
Yeah,
got,
yeah.
So this is kind of where we got to. We talked about the compositional factors. We also use like goals or ambitions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, underlying kind of like drives.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about. Right. Anyway, so the fifth of these, we're talking about consciousness, right? That was our next thing we wanted to talk about. And so this is where they start breaking down what might start to look like things that are archetypal.
And Eric, before we go, just to just catch people up. So this is these kind of like these 8 dissolutions.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Of a person, of a being, as they are sort of transitioning from this conscious waking life to the next step, the next stage. And so we kind of gave these first 4 last time that are physical, moving into the energetic, and now those are kind of viewed as like the external portion.
Yeah, the more the gross level or something.
The
like
gross.
that.
Okay, there we go. They said the gross level.
More gross
and then,
level. Yeah.
So we did that last time, and so we just get a little overview, and now we're going to kind of go into like the more subtle aspects of the Buddha nature, of the Shen, of the mind, of the soul, of more subtle.
Yeah. It's very interesting because you get to the point where you're really talking about things that are kind of like mental experiential here or something.
Yeah.
And it's, we've done episodes on this before, but like in Buddhist thought, like your consciousness, your mind, your spirit, your soul, or whatever exists. Like that's a thing. It's not just like your body buzzing away with some electricity. There's this other thing that's there. So now we're really kind of talking about that. All the form things have gone away, but you're kind of exploring the deeper recesses of what would be your own psyche, spirit, and consciousness and Shen and stuff. So you've gotten pretty deep at this point. If you think about it, you have like consciousness of all your sensory experiences, which is something we talked about in the last episode. You have your eyes and your ears. Eyes are associated with physical forms and, the earth element. And we talked about the ears and the water and smelling and the fire and all that. Those get a kind of a conversation point too. That's part of like our experience of ourselves, right? To have those sensory experiences. So Buddhism kind of points that out. You're always having sensory experiences. That are coming through, your sense organs into your consciousness, into your Shen, into your spirit, into your psyche, into who you are. But then you get to more like what the nature of this deeper part is. It's funny because they don't say this is as deep yet. So they still kind of say this is a little bit more gross level. But this is where the archetype thing comes up.
Okay.
And I find this really interesting. And I think for anyone who's thought about yin and yang in their life at any time, this is kind of interesting too. So what they kind of do is they kind of say that there are these 80 almost like archetypal mental states.
That's right.
They're not like, we haven't done our Carl Jung episodes yet. Like Carl Jung is really famous as the psychologist who talks about like archetypal things, mother archetypes and father archetypes and tricksters and all these kinds of things, which we still have to do an episode on.
Drunk uncle,
many things.
Drunk uncle archetype.
Yeah.
He's your favorite uncle though, for sure. Like by far, there is not a better one.
Or he's the one that like you have to stop inviting him to the family gatherings for various reasons.
Also,
to be honest, he might be your MAGA uncle.
Well, he could
depends
be
on the family. He could be your MAGA uncle.
That's right.
Depends on your family. Yeah. So anyways, it's this idea. It's not exactly like that though. It's more like these are like fundamental just universal like mental states or something like that. It's really interesting. And you get these lists. And of the 80, they're divided up into ones that are more yin, ones that are more yang, and then ones that are kind of neutral. So they go back to that same card being played again, ones that are kind of more on one side, ones that are more on the other side, and ones that are kind of more in the middle. And when you look at the lists, they're kind of interesting. You know, all the ones that are kind of yin aren't all negative, but you do get things that seem kind of yin. Like they talk about minds of like great sorrow that have to do with loss, or they'll talk about having like big fears, right? Or they'll talk about having like deep longings. And then there's some very primal things going on here, like hunger and thirst appear here. They're not all kind of negative, you know, like there's ones that talk about feeling kind of like peaceful in a yin way, right? Kind of a calm, peaceful feeling, not like a yang, fiery, excited feeling, but a yang, peaceful feeling. And there's some that are kind of like abstract, like they'll talk about shame or as a kind of like a general kind of fundamental emotional state, or jealousy. But then some of them are positive because they talk about feeling kind of a more yin, calm compassion, or a more yin kind of feeling of mercy. So I actually got the list up in front of me, so I'm just giving some examples of it.
And is there's like, it's like 37, 37, and 6 or something like that?
It goes like 33, 40, and 7.
Yeah, okay, close enough.
So from the yin ones, there's 33 of them. Now, we haven't done a lot on the subtle energy channels either.
No.
But to me, you're supposed to have this more yin subtle energy channel on the inside of the left side of the body.
Yeah.
And there's something where you can kind of notice that when your whole energetics maybe kind of pivots over to that side, you'll feel more of these kinds of minds, more of these kinds of vibes. So like when that particular part of the energetics are more going, you know, like if you've done any of this stuff yogically, sometimes, you know, you talk about like one channel on one side of the spine, one on the other, and one kind of in the middle, right? And they have the yogic name for those two. You might know them how they're talked about in Patanjali more than I would.
Yeah, Ida and Pingala.
Oh yeah, that's right. They don't use those terms exactly. And like,
no, the sun and the moon.
Yeah,
sun channel, moon channel.
So, you know, the idea that the one on the one side, and this is just interesting for me because I kind of feel like I had noticed that myself. I had noticed like, wow, there's something funny. I noticed it back in doing Zen, even though they didn't say it this way, but I had kind of noticed like, wow, when my left side is more active, I feel these kinds of feelings. When my right side is more active, I seem to feel like a different set of feelings. And you might, like, even if you do yoga or something, you might notice that in yourself, right? Or if you meditate, right? Sometimes you start to notice like, wow, things are shifting around inside of me. And when it's on this side, I seem to feel more like this. But when this side happens, I feel more like this. And sometimes the nostrils will open.
Yeah.
You know, like, and you'll feel that, like, if the left is really dominant, you're breathing through the left, you'll feel more of these yin minds. And when it gets to the other side, you'll feel more of what we're going to describe as the yang ones in a little bit.
The other part that's interesting from a physiological standpoint is they'll talk about this kind of like fluid shift in the body, this inner and external cellular fluids, right? Moving, crossing over the crossing in and out of the membranes. That's supposed to happen naturally as a part of like lymphatics, as a part of your cardiovascular system, but that it'll not only will move like internal and external in terms of like your intercellular matrix, but it'll also move the body left and right. You know,
like so move from one side or the other inside the body and collect more one way or the other.
Yeah. So it's supposed to, it's naturally supposed to do that. And so I think that, like, ideally, right, if you're balanced, everything has its, you know, you can kind of go back and forth. But if you are paying attention in the subtle states, or maybe when you're getting some acupuncture treatment, which if you're not, you should do that like immediately, as a shout out to acupuncture. But you know, you can definitely tell some of these states, you know, or some of these kind of like mindsets. And maybe you can't always tell, like, I'm more active or I'm less active, because you might just end up falling asleep on one side. Then
then you're probably like in the neutrality part. Sometimes you just kind of like veg out in the center, which we'll talk about, because you get a little veggie when that stuff happens. You're not too one side or the other. Yeah.
But these are, it's a cool, it's not just a thought experiment, you know, with some of this stuff it kind of is, but like these ones actually are not. You can kind of like, you could set out an intent, you could sit down with a meditation or lay down with a meditation with the intention of like experiencing whatever it is, and then just going in and seeing how it is when you connect to one side and the other.
I mean, like, I know, again, doing Zen, I just noticed it. I was just sitting there, like, counting my breath and, you know, semi-bored.
Mhm.
sometimes in great pain. Zen retreats are funny, you know, you learn a lot, right? So you're just kind of thrown in there and you just start to have experience. And I did start to notice that, like, wow, this is weird. My right nostril opened and I feel like much more peppy. I wonder what
Mhm.
that's about, you know? And now I can kind of say, okay, yeah, it's because you have these different qualities of how the energetics are going to affect your mind, depending on where
Mhm.
things are going. The way you talk about it with the like the lymphatics and cerebral spinal fluids and all these kinds
Mhm.
of fluid things on the physical level, they talk about that. And then sometimes when they talk about the more subtle energetics, they do talk about like channels, and they talk about energies that move through those channels. Sometimes I use the word winds, right?
Mhm.
And then the idea of these drops, like the subtle little kind of quasi hormonal drops going through or something in the subtle part. But I guess it's supposed to be more subtle than like your actual chemicals that are going through, you know. But anyways, it's interesting, right? They kind of like
Mhm.
a subtle physical version of this same thing. It seems like very neurological too,
Yeah.
right? It really has a neurological vibe.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, for our TCM listeners, the way I was presented with this, and it has always made sense to me that the TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, the acupuncture channels and things like that, probably are a little more tied to the physical body.
Yeah.
And then this kind of thing we're talking about now is a little bit more tied kind of to the psyche or the Shen or the consciousness of the person, right? So
Mhm.
it's a more subtle thing. So anyway, so that's the idea of this. And again, I found all this to be pretty helpful. You're right. There's a real physical thing you can notice with this. Oh, my body's doing different things. I can feel my mood changing, right?
Mhm.
I feel like all of it, once you use it, can become helpful because you can start to notice, oh, that's my feelings. Okay, this is my physical form. Those are my feelings. Oh, these are my concepts and categories. You know, like you can start to see those things in yourself. So I hopefully all of this ends up being practical.
Mhm.
But you're right, this can be quite striking because you can just get like a physical shift that you can notice on that physical level, and you can feel how much it affects your mind,
Mhm.
right? And like vice versa, I guess, right? Yeah. All right. So on those yin ones, then when you get to the yang ones, they have their own kinds of ups and downs with them. So they do mention joy here, and they kind of say like varying degrees of joy. It kind of goes, they do the same thing on the yin side, varying degrees of sorrow. You know, these are varying degrees of happinesses and joys. And then they talk about all the way up to rejoicing, and they use one called rapture, uh, excitement, yang things, amazement, contentment. Some of the sexuality stuff starts to kick in here too. And they're kind of named kind of funny because it says like a mind that wants to embrace,
Mm.
a mind that wants to kiss, a mind that wants to suck.
Mm.
um, but also for babies, you know,
Yes.
who feel happy at their mother's breast. Um, Effort is kind of interesting. Delight, flirtation.
Mm.
Yeah, so kind of like different human experiences, and I guess experiences of living things that are kind of like universal.
Mhm.
And then, but they all have their ups and downs here too. Like they talk about in the negative side, you might talk about pride here being more associated as kind of a yang state to be in. You feel kind of like hyped up and, you know, whatever you're feeling there in terms of feeling a little bit inflated in yourself, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, Heroism, you know, is mentioned here as a kind of a more positive thing that you're willing to go through and do something proactive. A mind wishing to overcome enemies such as delusions. Okay, that's said kind of a nice way, right? And then they can, but again, you know, some of them go back to negative things like uh, untruth. You know, sometimes you're in these yang states, you get a little overblown with yourself. I think about like when people are manic, right?
Mm.
They get kind of overblown in these waves. You know, they'll act out, be deluded. You know, so dishonesty. You know, sometimes when you're overhyped, you'll feel these feelings too in your state of excitement. So, anyways, these are yang minds at the end, and so that's sort of that part of the discussion. And I think it's interesting, you know, and you can kind of see when you're in those states. When you're in those states, you might get into some of those more yang things too. You might be more easily angry
Mhm.
or more easily desirous in a way that's kind of negative, right? Maybe makes you feel a little sneaky. Okay. So those are those minds. Those are the yang minds. Now you get to the point where you can ask the question. This is archetypal, right? But it's not like a Jungian archetype. This is different
No.
somehow.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You know, they're more like sub sub foundational. Maybe I should use that. You know,
Yeah.
sub something or other. What should go after the sub in this, but foundational covers it,
Yeah.
you know. So anyway, so what do you think? Does it strike you as archetypal?
I would say archetypal in the, not in a way of like a persona, because the young archetypes, it's a character of a number of different subtypes, so a number of these kind of aggregates underneath a larger header, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then that header has a name, so you could say, maybe we would say like the sad mother, or
like a mother archetype, but one of them might be like the sad and mournful mother, or one of them
the
might
mournful
be the
mother.
overbearing, one of them might be the very gentle and tender mother.
Correct.
All under this archetype. Yeah.
Correct. Right.
Now, I love that stuff. We haven't done the episodes on that, but this is obviously not that. It's different somehow, right?
Yeah, this is yeah, I think more foundational.
This does seem more foundational to me somehow.
Yeah, those are maybe that's like the archetypes I'm going to use a cooking comparison. So those are kind of like a recipe, and these are kind of like the ingredients.
Yeah, that probably makes sense to me. Something like that. Yeah, it's
if you want to make a chicken cacciatore, you got to come to the aggregates to get your cacciatore. I don't know what's in that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And then like you need your basic ingredients. You can have the whole recipe. You don't got any ingredients. You're not getting any chicken cacciatore or anything else, right? Yeah. So so that's kind of the idea of it. They are very foundational, and like I suppose part of the exercise then they say is that you can kind of observe these in yourself.
Yeah.
And again, if you like yin and yang thinking, it does make you realize, oh, these are kind of yin minds. I'm kind of bluesy. I'm kind of fearful. I'm kind of whatever. Oh, I'm in a yin state. And you can maybe start to feel that in yourself. Or you go on the flip side. I'm feeling all hyped. I'm feeling all happy. I'm feeling proud of myself. I'm feeling heroic. But I better be careful.
Because I don't want to get flirty.
I don't want to get too flirty over the top. But maybe I do. Anyways, these are yang minds, right? And it like produces these kinds of more excited kind of states, and you can kind of just recognize them in yourself, right?
We can call that one the longing father.
The longing father archetype. Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody has a hungry heart. I think Bruce Springsteen, the boss, sang that about that right. At some point or another. All right. So anyway, so this is these kinds of things that are more yang states. Interesting, so really dividing up in this way. And then they have the ones that are more neutral. And those are like 7 of them. I think usually this is supposed to be thought of as before almost like yin and yang differentiates or something like that. Before there's a real clear differentiation, you have this like these kind of funny states that are kind of like in the middle before strong either way. And they are kind of very, they're kind of very like neutral in the middle, maybe even a little bland or something. So they talk about like forgetfulness, so an unconcentrated kind of a mind. They talk about laziness. They talk about doubt. They talk about kind of being like stuck in the middle of attachment, equal, not one way or the other. You're not into something. You're not averse to something. You're kind of like in the middle. Non-speaking, so you're more withdrawn. The mind not wishing to speak. Anyway, so it's this kind of stuff. Forgetfulness, mistake, and that you're just kind of like bland and you're not recognizing things. Yeah. So in the middle, forgetfulness, mistakenness, laziness, doubt, these kinds of things. Maybe kind of like a bland kind of feeling of annoyance and depression that's just kind of like in the middle, like eh. So the whole thing I think is supposed to have kind of like an eh feeling to it. Like, eh, like that. Yeah. So those are the ones that are kind of there. Okay. That gets you to the 80. And so they're either more yin, more yang, or kind of like in the middle of this thing, kind of undivided. And that's the smallest group. But I know probably how a lot of people feel, these kind of blah minds or something like that. And again, they connect back to the channels in funny ways, one more to one side, one more to the other side, maybe one more in the center. Central channel is really important. So just to say that this is just these 7 minds of the central channel, I don't know if that totally covers it, but these are kind of like those non-differentiated, neither yin nor yang things. And that's kind of archetypal in a way, right? I found this to be useful though. Have you found this to be helpful?
Overall, I mean, yeah. You in order to get to them, you really got to be, I think you have to have a tendency, in addition to being subtle yourself, you have to have a tendency, like, I don't know that you could search out some of them. I guess you could.
guess if it's pointed out that it's kind of like that, you can maybe start to become aware of them. You
Sure.
know, I know for me, like again, it was something where I have a very strong sense of like weird imbalances, and I can feel things go from one side to the other.
Yeah.
And that like then I really did notice that, and I found that to be pretty helpful.
Yeah.
And at some point I decided, well, I bet should just, I mean, I kind of loosely memorize them, you know. And I was like, yeah, I can kind of be on the lookout for this. And I did start to notice those things in myself.
Mm,
And then you can start to go like, well, this is too sad, too bluesy, too whatever. Let me like
mm,
shift this shit over a little bit
mhm,
and get a little bit more yang. And you can start to feel like you have a little bit more flexibility in your own
mhm.
way of thinking about your own mood. But you're right, you have to like be paying attention to your emotions and your mental states to kind of find that, to get to that headspace even, to be able to
Mhm.
use these things. Right. Well, anyways, that's the consciousness aspect. And this is what's supposed to go next for the person, right? And that's going to be kind of dissolving. Even the capacity to have these very fundamental mental states will be disappearing. And I guess to what you were talking about earlier, Daniel, this is where things get really subtle. So this is all considered to be still a little bit more on the gross level, but after that it starts to get really subtle. And they talk about these three appearances, right? Um, and this is interesting, you know, like there's meditations on this
Mhm.
where you try to imagine these things all kind of like dissolving, right? I think we said last episode the Dalai Lama does this one 6 times a day, you know, because it's like a standard thing that you would do 6 times a day. You go through this process of letting all these parts of you kind of dissolve, and then eventually you go to these minds that are kind of like, or these experiences that are like very subtle, right? And they're kind of divided up into white, red, and black, which gets you back to that same idea. One side, the other side are kind of in the middle. So they almost say like the ability to kind of have an awareness of those mental kind of internal states that are more kind of yin or yang or neutral, kind of gives you a hint into being able to find these things underneath, these very fundamental internal experiences of maybe like pure yin, which would be like a white experience, right? They talk about that like the kind of like the way a moon looks or something like that, like the moon
Mm.
in the sky. And then as you experience like pure yin, so the dying person will experience pure yin, and then they'll experience pure yang, and that will look red and fiery, you know, maybe red or orange or something like that, like a sun. And then eventually they'll experience this experience of kind of just like darkness, right? But you know, Bob Thurman makes a big point. Not a darkness here that's like nothing, but a darkness that's before there's even like the division into yin and yang, the division into positive and negative, the division into electrons and protons or whatever. You're just in
Mm.
this neutrality, like, you know, pre-state. And this is kind of what they call these states of these, the subjective experience of the person is supposed to be, oh, a white like the moon, a red like the sun, and then this darkness, right? So going through these three states, and you can meditate on them, you know, as the Dalai Lama does 6 times a day, as you and I do. If we do 6 times a day, but we do it, right?
We do it.
Yep.
Not six. Not on retreat 6. Yes. Off
Yeah.
retreat. No.
A few times a day. I definitely do it multiple times a day. And, you know, so this is this idea. What was interesting to me is someone coming from like, again, like we were talking about earlier, Daniel, the Taoist world, it was kind of easy to go, oh, this is pure yin. Oh, this is pure yang. Oh, this is before yin and yang even divides itself. It was very easy to kind of understand it that way. Is that how you tended to think about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're also like, in doing the meditation, there's also like the visualization aspect to it. And at least when I'm doing it, sometimes I feel like other things might come up as you do it, you know?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And so there's just like this kind of like, as you get a familiarity with something, there's some kind of natural tendencies karmically or daily or who knows, celestial bodies are moving around and whatever that kind of call to you as you do it. And there's more there in that particular practice on that particular day.
So one of them might appear more vibrant on one day or another or something
Yes.
like that.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You and I had a conversation way, way back in the day on this, like a long time ago, where we were just talking about like sometimes it's easier when you're a dude to see the pure white thing, you know, and sometimes it's harder to see the red one or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, I think in the Buddhist tantric thought, you know, the male reproductive substances is, you know, it's white, it's the semen, it's the ejaculate, right? And the female is more associated with the red and the blood and the endometrial lining and the menstrual flow and all that. So it might be easier for women to see the red.
That's what they say.
Had this conversation back in the day. Well, you and I, before anyone even said it, we had this way back in the day in my dining room.
Yeah.
Talking about this, and it was like, it's easy to see white.
It is.
Know? Yeah, but it's hard to see red. And there was like a woman that we knew who was there. And she said, "Oh no, what's wrong with you? I can see the red all the time." We were like, "Well, okay.
There you go.
There you go." So anyways, that might be the case if you do try to meditate on these things. We have a promise that we're gonna do visualizations along with this.
Yeah.
Either as a little short meditative like addendum episode or as a separate thing. We'll decide how to do that. But anyways, yeah, so this is the idea that you know, the dying person is supposed to go through where they're kind of feeling like this deepest part of who they are, and probably the deepest part of the universe on some level. They're experiencing it at this point. They're experiencing pure yin with the moon, pure yang with the fiery glow of a sun, or, you know, that kind of a thing. And then the union before things have even differentiated. So that's it.
You can call it primordial, you know, polar energy.
Yeah. And you get to, like, this is why this is kind of interesting, because they kind of say that these things only happen in certain moments where you get to see these things. You can meditate on them and try to like get a sense of them that way. And then they kind of spontaneously happen as the person's life ends, right? Because the thing that holds the person together starts to like come apart. These fundamental energies that hold a living thing together are dissolving, right? They kind of say like you get, I mean, if you want to go through like what we were talking about before with the reproductive substances, they kind of say like you have like your white genetic part of you that comes from your father's side, and then the red part that comes from the mother's side, or, you know, one side or the other, right, come together. Those two energies come together, and then they kind of make this union, right? But as you get to the end of your life, even those like the most primal aspects start to like come apart. Like, that's the idea of it. Yeah. Okay. So black, dark appearance. And then the idea is that kind of like splits open, right? And after that, you reach what is the most subtle aspect of a living thing. So this is kind of where all of this process has been leading. And in terms of what you call this, this is where you would talk about like a Buddha nature, like what you were talking about, I think, more in the beginning of the episode even, right? You know, getting down to that really core part of what makes up a living thing. I think if you like a little bit more Taoist stuff, you might call this the Yuan Shen, or the original Shen of the person, right? It's the deepest aspect of the soul of the person, or the spirit of the person, however you want to frame that. Coming from the Dalai Lama school, which is kind of like our touch point for this, you know, they'll sometimes more talk about this and how it sort of feels to a person experiencing this. So they'll sometimes call it the clear light mind, or they'll call it a clear light mind of bliss and emptiness, potentially, if you built this up. So there's a kind of a question, is this inherently blissful and empty, or is it like something that you learn how to see it that way? That's a kind of a solo point. But in any case, sometimes you'll hear this idea of the clear light mind, or the clear light mind of bliss and emptiness. I guess emptiness here in the sense that it's kind of formless, which when it hit me, it made sense, because like, you know, I'm Eric now, but I'm not always going to be Eric in this way of thinking. I'm going to be somebody else. I was somebody else before. So when you get to the core of who a person is, it has to be kind of formless. It can't be Eric. Otherwise, Eric would keep existing forever. And he's obviously not going to. Fucking son of a bitch. Damn it. But okay, that's how it is. Got to accept it. And, you know, so when you get to the core of who you are, it's like not any particular somebody.
That's right.
It's not like what the old jokes about like all the Hollywood people who would do their like previous life experiences, and they were always like Cleopatra, or like Amenhotep or Nefertiti or something. No, it's like a formless thing, right? So, you know, that's the idea of like a Buddha nature, or the root of like who you are at the very deepest part, right?
Yeah, Robert Thurman makes he drives this point home a lot, that when you make the effort to look for yourself, you end up, chasing your tail like a dog, right? And you're spinning
Yeah.
and spinning, and so you cannot find, and eventually you come to the point where you realize, oh, there is no me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like,
That's the the selflessness of a person or the emptiness of a person or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I also like the term, and I think Bobby T's used it, and some other people have used it, like the term freedom, you know,
Mm.
in addition or alongside emptiness, just because like emptiness is lacking intrinsic thing, freedom free from intrinsic thing, like you're kind of like one is a negation, and our minds, I don't know if it's a Western mind or whatever, or at least my mind, when you have a negation of a thing, it almost, I don't know, it feels vacuous on some level, but it's not actually vacuous of it's not vacuous of anything, it's vacuous of thing.
Yeah, they sometimes call it like other emptiness. It's
Mm,
just empty of these other things.
right.
Right. And what is it full of? Well, it's full of like clear light, blissfulness.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Hence Robert Thurman, Bobby T's book, alternate title, Cheer the Fuck Up.
That's right.
Right. Because this is the core of who you are. He tries
Yeah.
to make that point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, I came from this through Zen. That was my initial thing. And certainly in the school of Zen I was doing, they didn't tell you. Zen is funny. They don't tell you shit. They just say, go meditate, breathe this way, do these things. Right. But like in a way, I think in the Zen I was doing for sure, they wanted you to hit this thing,
Mm-hmm.
this Buddha nature part. Hakuin, the founder of the school, has a whole long poem he writes about Buddha nature, right? And again, I was like in my 20s, I was just trying to learn things as I was going. But I think this was the experience they were driving towards. And you can get glimpses of this.
Mm-hmm.
You get very deeply meditative, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, okay, there's something else here that I didn't realize was me somehow, this like deep state. And it's very pleasant, And I can remember hitting it, and I remember feeling like I could be like Captain America. We were talking like before the show even started. I could do this all day. That's his line from the Avengers. I could do this all day. I was like meditating. I was like, I could do this shit forever, because you hit the core of who you are, and it's very, it's revelatory and feels really good.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, that's kind of this idea. But I didn't know any of this theory. That was kind of interesting. It was more like plonky, and it was experiential for me. So then like I think learning more about it later on was just like the other half of something. I mean, I knew the term Buddha nature, obviously, and I had an idea of it, but not all of this detail, and like clear light mind of bliss and emptiness, that kind of vibes with how it sort of felt to me, to the extent that I've experienced this, doing all this Zen stuff. So anyway, so that's the idea. This is the deepest part of who you are. And the root of that person's spirit or whatever. And then that's it. All you have to just do is stay there.
Don't move.
Problem solved. All right. But the observation is made that this probably isn't going to happen for most folks. There's a whole part of, again, using the school of Dalai Lama as kind of the touch point here, where you can say that you can meditate on this in your lifetime, and you can also meditate on this as you're passing, right? And you can seek enlightenment at this point too, and recognize this is the core of who you are. And then you start to have like the enlightenment experience going in another direction. But for most people, it's not going to go that way. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that once you hit the final core of this kind of universal ground of who you are, I guess you should also say that this is kind of like you might call it the ground of being, or you might call it Tao, or you might call it, like, you like the term the endless when we're using the Kabbalistic terms.
Love it.
This is it, right? This is like you're hitting the inner aspect of this within yourself that's undifferentiated from the external aspect. Sometimes I'll describe this as like water pouring into water. I think we talked about this last episode.
Yeah, I talked with my friend Daniel, the Kabbalist guy. Yeah, and he said he's like endless. He's like, that's an interesting way of translating it. I think he would say that they would call it without end.
Yeah, without end. Ein Sof.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In English, it's like those are kind of close.
No, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, without end, or the endless. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this idea, like, I think that like this is the part of yourself that's like the same as like the source of everything, or something like that. if you want to look from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're like maybe more of a theistic person, right? This is where you kind of hit your part of yourself that's the divinity within or something like
Yeah.
that.
I will say though, from my couple of experiences where I've definitely hit that, it's alive.
Yeah. It's not a
It,
nothing.
it's not enough. It's not just like, oh, here's a light. It's an LED, 2400K HID LED in the middle of like a space, you know. It really like emerges, like it's an emergence from nothing, what seems like nothing, like just sheer anything and everything and nothing at the same time. And then it just kind of appears. And at least in my experience, when it appears, it appears as like a being would, like a being who was watching you almost, and you were kind of not lost or something like that, but you're searching or wandering or whatever, going down a path. And then, and it's totally dark at night. And then your cool uncle, who is, not
the MAGA one,
not the MAGA one, but like
he might have a buzz on, but he's like, yeah, he's not.
But he's totally chill, bro. It's just Mike's hard lemonade. He's fine.
Yeah. It's a barbecue.
Yeah, but like they would just emerge from this middle of the forest, dressed in like all white with all of the things that you would need: water and a flashlight and a coat and some heating pads for your toes. Like everything that you would need just kind of seems to come up and presents a very, I don't know, nourishing experience.
Heating pads for your toes.
Well, you're cold.
You're cold. Yeah, that's right. You're gonna be cold. You need some heating pads. That's true.
You need some heating pads for your toes. But
it's an interesting device, just like separate little heating pads for each toe.
Yeah, what's it like? You break them up, you put them in your shoe, you walk around.
Yeah, it's nice.
But yeah, so it's like it kind of emerges from essentially nowhere really, but at the same time it also has a presence to it, and it feels like consciousness itself. I don't know if it's hard to describe.
Yeah. So it's like a funny thing, because isn't that like, this is like at the root of like how people think about this overall, right? Do you see this as like a separate being? Do you see it as you? Do you see it as like everything? Like, how do you see this, right? This is like the conundrum part of this, right?
I will tell you for myself.
Obviously, different traditions will kind of like emphasize different parts of this, and probably then different people will have different subjective ways that they relate to this, right?
I didn't see it as me. I definitely didn't see it as me, but I would say I didn't see it as separate from me either. So it sort of like came up from me, but from somewhere else also. You know what I'm saying?
Like the question of like, each of us get to ask, is this a statement about what this is, a statement about my personality and how I experience this? There's no doubt, like when you meditate this on a daily basis, you're supposed to say, okay, this thing is me.
Yeah.
In the Buddhist Tantra thing, right? So that doesn't mean you have to do that, but that's how this is framed,
right?
There's like a little like verse in Sanskrit about this. In Gelik Rinpoche's version of this, it was actually translated by the really famous beat poet Allen Ginsberg. So he took the Sanskrit and kind of made it into kind of like a little mini verse of poetry. It's not that, like, wow, so poetic, but he did render it, and it's something I should look at the exact words. I don't always do them in exactly those words, when I get to this, but there is this whole idea, like you said, like, okay, this is bliss, emptiness, this is who I am, this is the root of who I am, but you can kind of see like different people will go and maybe have different versions of this experience, and like it'll hit them in different ways, right? Very personal. Yeah,
very personal.
Okay, so this is the, if we talk about like the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Book of the Bardo, this is this place that everyone goes to, and maybe like an experience that you have glimpses of at different times during your life. They say you have it sometimes during sleep, you'll hit this thing. Sometimes it'll happen like during sexuality, you'll hit this thing. Sometimes it'll happen, in other funny ways. You'll have glimpses and flashes of this. You can try to get to a meditative place where you experience this, which is powerful. But this is the core of who a person is. And, this is like, kind of the separation of yin and yang, and it's at the end game, right? What you were talking about, Daniel. Now the spirit is separated from the body. And this is where you start talking about this thing called the Bardo, something that most people are going to kind of like move on in their story right at this point. So this is the Bardo experience. And the Bardo is translated like by Robert Thurman as the between, and most people by the between. So this is this between experience that really happens like once the person is pulled back out of this clear light, bliss, emptiness, Buddha nature, experiencing that part of who they are, they come back out again. Why do you come back out again? And the idea is that you usually are probably driven by something inside your own like deepest parts of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your deepest parts of the psyche of your spirit or something like that
Mm-hmm.
will still be pulled out, right? And so the person comes out of this experience, and then it's very interesting to think about how to describe this, you know, because now a whole bunch of things will start to appear to the person. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo, they kind of describe it probably in the way a Buddhist person would see it, but you have to imagine other people would see this in other ways, and you know, we can think about that. But the mind comes out of this deepest part of who it is, and now it's sort of like in a certain sense experiencing itself, and it's experiencing the world in this very kind of deep, energetic, and symbolic way. So in terms of like the outer world, space doesn't matter as much. There's this idea that you can have all kinds of experiences that will seem to be not limited by space. But it's also there's like almost the idea you get the sense that you're really experiencing kind of like, again, your own inner world as much as you're experiencing anything external. And the idea is that this kind of happens in stages then. Once the mind leaves this clear light thing, you'll start to experience a whole range of different probably experiences of yourself. Some will be initially more pleasant. So you'll come out and you'll experience of the pleasant, adverse, and neutral. You'll first experience the more pleasant states. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they kind of advise the person to kind of imagine all the blissful deities that they've been meditating on in their life or something like that, right? But this might be, you know, if you're not a tantric person, you'll just have experiences that are kind of pleasant, right? So the initial experiences is kind of like almost like an internal inventory of pleasant experiences and images. Does that make sense as a way to put it, Daniel?
Yeah, I think
so.
so.
That happens first, you know, and you're kind of like your Shen or your spirit isn't connected to any physical body, right? So it's kind of experiencing itself, or if experiences the world, it experiences this in this very fluid way because it's not kind of bound in the same way, space and time wise, as we are when we're tied into a physical body, like the way we are in our normal lives. But okay, we'll think of it mostly as like experiencing your inner world. So you experience the positive states, and that goes on for a while. And then you start to experience things that veer more towards the neutral side. So you start having like subjective neutral experiences. And again, in the kind of like the Buddhist tantric world, you'd be probably meditating on divinities that have more of that neutral quality to them or something like that. And then the idea is that eventually it'll start to veer towards the more unpleasant internal states will start to appear. And then what the person will subjectively experience then, in a certain sense, you're experiencing your own internal world, your own internality. But as far as what you'll be kind of seeing in that time will be things that will seem frightening, or things that will seem, frightening, scary, sad, hostile, whatever. This is a little bit sometimes when you listen to how they talk about why sometimes you meditate on Buddhist images that are kind of scary, scary looking, you know, aggressive looking. It's to like learn how to handle these sides inside of yourself. But also when you have these experiences in meditation or maybe in death, you're not scared by them so much, right? They don't overwhelm you. Your own fearful, sad and scary parts of yourself don't overwhelm you because you've been meditating on them, right? To prepare for these kinds of internal experiences. But the gist in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is once it gets to that point, well, then there becomes a desire to not like be doing this anymore. You don't want to do this anymore. And so this is the point in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo where they talk about like trying to find your next life. So now this Bardo being, they sometimes use that term for this, will start looking around for like, okay, how do I get out of these scary, unpleasant experiences? And that will lead them to try to look for another life where they hook back up again into physicality. So they're being drawn back into form. And usually what it's described as this being is sort of now looking not in itself, but out at the world and looking for parents that would look good. Right? So it's like scanning around.
Tinder.
Cruising. That's it. It's swiping left repeatedly. But yeah, looking for this thing, right? And there is this idea of like there's a sexuality aspect to this, which is kind of interesting. This idea of being drawn to sexuality and the joys of sexuality and the pleasures of sexuality. That's naturally something that the spirit will gravitate towards, right? It's drawn towards that. But also the idea that it's drawn towards parents that one feels probably some kind of connection with, right? You're being drawn by some kind of connection. And whether this is totally conscious or not, that's always kind of like, usually in Buddhism, they don't say this is entirely conscious. This gets to be kind of like not something that you're sort of like thinking like, okay, these people look pretty good, but they have some character flaws. Maybe I should avoid them or something. It's much more like reactive, right? Because there's kind of, you're in this scary state and you start thinking, okay, I want to get out of this. And you're drawn to the sexuality component, and you're also drawn towards certain people just in some instinctive way, right? Intuitive, instinctive way. And this will connect you to your parents, right? And then the spirit will become entwined with the reproductive substances of the parents, and the magic of conception occurs. And now here we all are. This is the backstory of how we got to where we are, and you'll have some connection or another. There's a kind of an interesting energetic karmic pull that happens here, and people wind up where they are. So that's the story of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. What do you think? That end part's kind of interesting to me. It pulls together a lot of interesting pieces of like, there's a sexuality component, being drawn towards that, and then being drawn towards parents that you feel some connection with some way or another, right?
But what is the
life that you'll feel connected to?
For people, what is the so you have this, positive, neutral, and then negative, but what if you're able to transcend the pull of the sort of harder or more difficult, more fearful aspects of oneself? Because that's the goal is to be able to have control over this, right? Not be so following momentum, repeating.
Well, this gets to this interesting question of like, okay, Lama Tsongkhapa, right, founder of the school of the Lamas, talks about this idea like you can get enlightened in the Bardo, right? How does that happen? You go through and you recognize this deepest part of who you are as who you are, and this becomes sort of a certain part of the enlightenment aspect of the person, right? They use this word dharmakaya for it, truth body. Right? And at that point, usually because you've been kind of meditating on this over and over again, you then realize that, okay, I can start to energetically expand myself out into the world in a way that's much more controlled. And I can start like, becoming an energetic, enlightened being, that will like reach out to everything with love and compassion and trying to help everybody out. That's enlightenment, technically speaking. We actually haven't done that episode. What's enlightenment, right? I think we had Bobby T on to talk about it, but he's so technical.
He's very technical.
Very technical, but very like quirky.
But the return
in a completely lovable way.
Yeah, of course.
So that's one way. But then they also do talk about what you're saying too, that people can start to get more conscious during this and choose where they're born in a much more conscious way. That's another way this is talked about. That's for sure. Maybe more what you're even talking about, right? Yeah, that you're able to kind of go like, okay, let me try to put myself in the optimal position. And again, they talk about this in the Tibetan tradition. Like people will go, okay, these look like good parents for me. It's much more of a conscious choice rather than this reactive thing. So, they do talk about it that way.
But then just for technical terms that we may have to break down next time, but the movement from the Bardo state to, I would say maybe like more evenly distributed energetic emanations, that's the Nirmanakaya at that point.
Yeah, so it's supposed to be like, this is really interesting. This is like what enlightenment is, when you look at it through this framework, right? So in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo, the idea is that when you hit this pure, clear light bliss mind, this is the seed of what will be this pure formless energy body of an enlightened being, right? Not limited by space and time, right? And then they say that there's a subtle energetic aspect that comes out, which is analogous to what happens in the Bardo. So the Bardo energetic part of the person becomes this thing called the Sambhogakaya, which gets translated as enjoyment body. Bobby T, I think, makes the point that this is the root of the same word for like orgasm, right? So it's just an energetic permutation of the person, like the Matrix, except not some creepy Keanu Lawrence Fishburne, but you are a matrix that goes out radiating good vibrations to everybody. And then the Nirmanakaya is the idea that that's kind of interesting, because either like it comes out as an individual person, or the idea that it's kind of, again, is like kind of a more gross level energetic matrix or something like that that goes out. That's kind of interesting, right?
And are you?
So we actually haven't done the technical what the fuck is this enlightenment thing? Anyways, we tried it at various times.
Let's just do it. Let's just do it next week then.
Okay, we'll see. Maybe we do it next week,
because
it's like, you know, that's been kind of a question, and again, we consciously had Robert Thurman on to talk about this.
We did.
But once he starts rolling, you can't stop Bobby T.
He's a train, man. He's a freight train of like 100 cars, you know, and we're just two guys just trying to stop it.
You can be an immovable object, but he is like an unstoppable force.
Unstoppable force.
He's an unstoppable verbal force.
He is of wit and wisdom.
Of wit and wisdom. And cheer the fuck up.
That's right.
So yeah, we wanted to talk about, but he's so technical. And it's funny because you and I are probably more, we both have like kind of a little bit of a physics interest in our background.
For sure.
So we're kind of like, well, what is it?
Yeah.
And it's this kind of energetic matrix idea, you know, that the core of every person has the potential to become this big, beautiful, kind of divine, you know, beautiful matrix, reaching out with love and good vibes for everybody.
Yeah.
That's the idea in the end, right? But it's so, I think it's hard. It's so abstract that I think when you first hear it, you're like, what?
Yeah, but I think
that's the idea.
Like, you know, I mean, I've heard this discussion so many times, and like every time I hear it, it opens another door opens, you know. So I'm thinking maybe like 30 more times. So if we can do another one, that'll knock it down to 29. And you know, and listen, every
time it's a lifetime taken off. That's what they say.
Okay, right? Good. Let's knock one off, man. You know, like
I'm down to 37 more lifetimes.
Not bad. Not bad.
Pretty good. Pretty good if you think of all of eternity.
Yeah. You know, at least I got a number, you know.
No, the thing that's interesting about it is they, you know, when they, again, this is a thing for me. I came from different things before I got into this Tibetan Buddhist thing. And this is what they ask you to meditate on every day.
Yeah.
They ask you to meditate on, go back to this, and imagine it coming out as this big uber rock star divine energetic form called enlightenment.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And I can kind of remember, I was trying to talk about with when Robert Thurman was on, I was like, there was some old magazine called What is Enlightenment? And I remember looking at the magazine. He really trashed it, deservedly so, in the episode. It was pretty bad, but and probably a little culty. But I remember that question going, what is this thing supposed to be? And there's actually an answer. It's supposed to be this, right? I suppose like meeting Lama Glenn Mullen was kind of interesting because he has that sciencey part of him too. I didn't realize until we did our episode with him. He was an engineering student. I was like, okay, now I know why we can talk to one another, because it's like, how does it work?
So what is it?
Robert Thurman's more philosophical, maybe beautiful language, poetically abstract or something.
Yes.
Yeah. Or Lama Glenn might be more like, well, this is what it is, because I'm an engineer at heart or something. Yeah, so it's this big energetic form, really, you know, that, you know, I guess in Robert Thurman's thing, it would be like, this is the evolutionary ultimate end goal of every living thing to reach this place.
He said it numerous times, that not only is that the evolutionary form, but that's your birthright, which I love that idea, you know, as like a ground level thing. Like,
it's the seed level potential of really who you are that eventually it's going to actualize itself.
Yes,
for all of us. Yeah,
you know, it's like looking at an evolution of a human. You know, not an evolution, but the growth of a human from child to adult. Like eventually, you'll get to that place. It's just you're going to be a 7-year-old for the next 200 years. You know,
like the United States,
right?
Yeah,
I would say we're more like probably 4, man.
we're in our terrible 2s.
We are, yeah. We're never leaving either.
It's a kind of an interesting thing, because you're right. It's very optimistic. It's very positive. I just banged this thing.
That's gonna sound great.
Yeah, it's bang. Yeah, but it's very positive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, I gotta hop here in a minute. So let's wrap it if you know.
Okay, so our idea is that we have other things to talk about. We have sex and love to talk about too, but we'll maybe do one thing on enlightenment.
Yeah, I think
before we talk about sex and love. All right.
Yeah. So we can come. We can return as desirous deities.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and then we will perfect the entwinements of
in a perpetual state of bliss and emptiness, and in loving entwinedness, right, going on forever, but reaching out with love and compassion for all beings.
There you go. That's correct. Just like that.
That's the Buddhist tantric end goal.
That's it. That's it. All right, Eric. Well, as usual, thank you so much, my friend. This was far more of a kind of a one-way lecture today, but I always
no, we talked though. I mean, I was like
we did, but I like I like this because I'm even though I'm more familiar with people than most of the people who are listening, but less familiar than yourself. So it's always a good opportunity for me to kind of refine things.
I always love this thing because we throw things out between one another, and you get to hear how the other person thinks about it.
Yeah.
So it's always and that's the same with an audience, right? You get to hear how other people in the audience think about it too.
And speaking of hearing how the audience thinks, we certainly love to hear from people. So hit us up at jinandtantra@gmail.com. Hit us up on Instagram at Jin and Tantra. We're going to be making a little bit more of an effort to kind of do things on YouTube. So if you're watching us on the video, on whatever platform you're watching us on, don't make sure to give us a thumbs up and a like and a subscribe, and share with us or share our work with other people. We definitely appreciate the audience. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, things you'd like for us to cover, please feel free, hit us up, leave a comment wherever the comments are left. I'm sure it'll make it back to me somehow, some way, by the grace of our spirits.
It's kind of like we're trying to make a community thing here in part 2. We're both community-minded people in that way. And like even this whole series of episodes was because someone in our community went through something.
Yeah. So
if you're going through something, reach out.
Yeah, we never know it. I mean, and honestly, like, death is a part of life. I know it sounds odd, but like it's true. So we're always going to be dealing with, loss of some type or transition of some type. So why not do it consciously? Why pretend as if it's never going to happen? Because I think a lot of us live our lives as if the end is not nigh, but it is. Bill Nye, the science guy. And
even for him, he's not going to go on forever.
He's not going to go on forever. So we try to be these like psycho-spiritual scientists.
Oh, that's a very Bobby T phrase.
That's right. That's right. And and we do our best. So as always, Eric, thanks for doing the work. Audience, thank you so much for listening and watching, and however you're consuming this. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace.